Hi, how are you? It's late, but I am thinking, and this time I thought I'd think on camera. I was asked this past Sunday a very interesting question. I was asked, how is it, as a Reformed guy, that you have maintained your premillennial eschatological leanings? And I guess I had never thought about it quite that way. I liked the question, so I thought I'd make a video about it. Now, historically, I come out of a church that was Arminian, very Arminian, but was also premillennial. So when I came out here and became familiar with the doctrines of grace, I was willing to throw out everything because clearly my soteriology was wrong. I changed my soteriology. In many ways, I changed my ecclesiology and my thinking about church and how church ought to be done. And I was perfectly willing to change my eschatology as well, to bring it all into fully reformed thinking, because I was really looking for consistency. I'm a fool for consistency in theology. And what I came to recognize was that reformed soteriology and eschatology are actually hermeneutically inconsistent. And whenever I find inconsistency, it bothers me. I think that Reformed theology and premillennialism actually is hermeneutically consistent. Okay, I've thrown around a bunch of big words here late at night. Let me tell you what I'm talking about. So I was at the church out in Franklin, and the pastor out there knew of my premillennial leanings, and so he, from his own library, took a book by Lorraine Bettner on postmillennialism, and he gave it to me, big, thick book. And he gave it to me and said, "Here, this will convince you." And so I read it, cover to cover, read the whole thing. Took it back to him a couple weeks later, and he said, "Well, did it convince you?" And I said, "Yeah, it convinced me that premillennialism is right." And the reason was, as Bettner was making his postmillennial argument, he was having to truncate sections of the Bible that didn't fit his scheme. And whenever I see that, that's a red flag. I know that I've talked before about the fact that a fellow who did become a friend of mine wrote a book in which he was arguing that the church is the new Israel, the spiritual Israel. And when he quoted the New Covenant, both from Jeremiah 31 and the recitation of it in Hebrews 8, both times he said that that covenant was made, quote, with the house of Israel, and then he added an ellipsis where the house of Judah was, and then went on and talked about the new covenant. And that raised all kind of red flags in my mind. Why did you have to put an ellipsis there? Well, obviously, it's because there's no way to say that the house of Judah is the church, the spiritual church, or the new church, or any of that. So he just exunced it. He just got rid of it. He just added an ellipsis. And to me, that's not playing fair with the text. You have to allow the text to say what it says. Now, also, if you're looking at the church historically, there's really not much argumentation that for the first roughly 300 years of the church's existence, it was primarily premillennial. And sure, there's been development since then, but not until Augustine, really, do you see the beginning, the encroachments of what we would today call amillennialism. And so I think the closer you can get to the first century apostles, the closer you can get to the original authors, the closer you're getting to the truth. So I think if they were convinced of premillennialism after hearing right from Jesus, then it seems like that's the safe road to be on. A minute ago I mentioned hermeneutical consistency and inconsistency. And here's what I mean by that then. When I read Reformed authors, oh, and I should also say, if you're talking historically, the Reformation was all about how people get saved. It was about whether free will played a major role in man's salvation or whether it was the work of a sovereign God. So it really was all about soteriology. It was about how people get saved. And so you can read all of the reformers of that period, Luther and Calvin and Zwingli, Huss. You can read through them and you won't find any great discussions about eschatology, because that isn't what they were concentrating on. And when they did speak in any aspect about eschatology, they really just kind of imported their Catholic eschatology into their thinking. Now, I am a great fan of semper reformanda, always reforming. The reformers said that the church was to be always reforming. So I was always reforming my thinking, always willing to, if I had some new information, if I was given some new input, I was willing to reform my thinking, to bring it in league, and to bring that information into my larger theology. Okay, so knowing that Reformation theology didn't really talk about eschatology, that really wasn't the point. When you talk about Reformation theology, when you talk about sovereign grace theology, when you listen to the voices, the Reformed voices speak, when it comes to the subject of soteriology, they're very firm because they're able to accentuate what the Bible actually says. And the Bible has a lot to say about God's election, God's predestination, and that when it comes to the salvation of people, it's not of him that wills or him that runs, but of God that shows mercy. Okay, so that's consistent. That's very consistent. Reformed thinkers are hermeneutically in league with the Bible when it comes to soteriology. And they read what the Bible says, they read it at face value, and they say, that's what it says. It's right there. That's what it says. But then when it comes to eschatology, when it comes to the book of Daniel or the book of Revelation or any of that kind of stuff, Matthew 24, suddenly that hermeneutical consistency goes right out the window, and they're suddenly willing to allegorize. And they're suddenly willing to spiritualize the text. Essentially, they're saying, this is what the text says, but it isn't what it means. So when they're talking about how people get saved, they're hermeneutically consistent in their reading of the text. But when it comes to eschatology, they're very inconsistent and are willing to allegorize. And as I have said so many times, the problem with allegorization is that the meaning of the text then changes according to the allegorist. And so I think if you read the Bible for what it says, if you just read it at face value, and most amillennialists are willing to admit this, I don't know about post-mills, but if you just read it for what it says, it will lead you to a premillennial way of thinking. You have to do some pretty fancy gymnastics hermeneutically to separate the 19th chapter of Revelation from the 20th chapter of Revelation. I've made videos about that John uses a literary device throughout chapters 19 and 20, where he keeps using the word kai and versions of that. And this, and that, and I saw, and this happened, and that. And if you just read chapter 19 and 20 and ignore the chapter divisions, they run concurrently. In other words, it's not just mathematical that 19 comes before 20. it's also hermeneutic and literarily a consistent form that John uses to write in order to say that this is sequential, and this, and this, and this, and this. That is hermeneutically consistent, is to let the Bible say what it says and to let the author make his own point. And John was making a very consistent point that chapter 19, as we call it, comes before chapter 20. And so when people start doing those kind of hermeneutic gymnastics and arguing against the natural reading of the text, I can't go there. I just can't do it. I would rather stay with a natural reading of the text, let the text speak, let it say what it says. And the truth of the matter is, I can read the Reformed passages. I can read the passages that have to do with election or predestination, and I can just let them say what they say, and I'm comfortable with a sovereign God who's willing to speak that way. But then at the exact same time, I'm willing to let that same God tell us what he wants us to know about eschatology. And I don't feel the need to allegorize it or to say something silly like, well, that's apocalyptic literature. Well, yes, the book of Revelation, the Greek word is the apocalypsis, the apocalypse. So if you're saying that the apocalypse is apocalyptic, okay, fine, I agree. But the fact is, you still don't know more about what John saw than John did. And John saw it, and John wrote what he was told to write. And so we can really only understand it by reading what he said and letting him explain it to us. Now, yes, it includes symbols, but those symbols are also found, for the most part, in other places of the Bible. So if we're being hermeneutically consistent, we let the Bible interpret the Bible. So for all those reasons, for historic reasons, like knowing that the earliest church believed in premillennialism, and knowing that there was actually a political rationale in order to protect Rome, and actually a genuine anti-Semitism that drove so much of Augustine's eschatology, and that didn't come about until hundreds of years after Christ was here and gone. I just prefer to be able to read the Bible consistently, to not have to change my hermeneutic as I'm going through it. And so I'm willing to be both reformed in my soteriology, but then I have also maintained my premillennialism because that is the most consistent story that the Bible is telling. And yes, through the years, I have had plenty of people write to me and argue with me and say to me, well, then you're not fully reformed because you're premillennial. And the reformers were amillennial, and therefore, if you're going to be fully reformed, you need to embrace amillennialism. I think I'm more consistent with the reformers because they believed in always reforming, which is exactly what I have done through my whole life. Now, let me say one last thing here. I've probably kept you too long already. I'm perfectly willing to be wrong if somebody can just show me where I'm wrong. I want to be right. I want to, especially after having taught the Bible for 25 years, I don't want to teach error. I don't want to say things that I can't prove from the Bible. So if somebody could prove amillennialism to me from the Bible without having to allegorize it, without having to do all the hermeneutical gymnastics, if they could just show me where it is stated plainly in the Bible, well, then I would have to take a look at that. I'd have to embrace it. I'd have to figure out whether or not what I'm saying, what I'm believing right now is fully true. Same goes for postmillennialism. Same goes for any eschatological position. I was fully convinced of Arminianism, though I didn't know it was called that, until I was shown from the Bible God's sovereignty in election and God's predestinary will and how he does everything to the glory of his grace. And once I understood that, I was cornered. I had to change. If somebody could show me plainly from the Bible, I mean, in the text, without having to do a bunch of, well, we'll take a phrase from here and a phrase from over there, we'll put some stuff together and then logically conclude something else. If somebody could just show me in the text where it says it, I'd be cornered. I'd have to change. But so far, no one has done that. And I have listened to a lot of amillennial teaching. I have listened to a lot of postmillennial teaching. And I just remain unconvinced because I am convinced of what the Bible says. And that is my job, to teach what the Bible says. So therefore, I am Reformed and premillennial. It was a good question, and it caused me to think. And so here late at night, I thought I would share that thinking with you. I hope any of that was helpful or valuable. It's good to see you again. Thanks for dialing up the Salvation by Grace org YouTube channel once again. Thanks to everybody who has subscribed, and thanks to everybody who has kept GCA going low these 25 years. I do appreciate it. See you later. Bye.